Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. It is a steamy Friday afternoon here in Washington, D.C. I'm Heather Hurlburt from the National Security Network, and with me...
In a steamy Boston area suburb is Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and foreignpolicy.com.
Now, Dan, our Blogging Heads overlords were really hoping that we would do, this would be Olympic themed. You made a confession to me, which was quite shocking, that you weren't following the Olympics, which I don't even think is true.
It's totally true, but I've been following the complaints on Twitter about how NBC is covering the Olympics. And I did watch the opening ceremonies, but I think I've watched maybe like 2 minutes of the actual sports at this point. I am looking forward a little more to the track and field stuff.
And I boycotted the opening ceremonies largely based on the ridiculous commentary on Twitter. Twitter has totally changed, actually, the way I watch. It is kind of funny.
So how has it changed? I'm curious.
Well, one is I really cannot avoid knowing things because I go, we in my household we were always mocked as kids for wanting not to know how things had come out until we could see them on TV. But it's completely unavoidable because there's no such thing as a spoiler alert on Twitter.
Although I would, there's a very interesting different set of norms here because. On the Olympic stuff and on sports stuff, there's no norm whatsoever about, spoilers or anything like that. Everyone's like, yes, this is what happened. But if you think about things like movies, for example, people are very, very, usually pretty careful about, tweeting, like plot developments in movies, which I find fascinating.
Well, the upside of Twitter, though, is that it's like being in a bar, in that you're sort of watching on your TV and then you're seeing how other people react to whatever ridiculous thing it is that you just saw. So that's fun. I was, however, going to make one snarky remark, which will transition us back to more familiar national security ground, which is that while he was in Poland it's Monday, it's this week still, Mitt Romney doubled down on his remark, which many of us saw as a gaffe, that Russia is the U.S. #1 geopolitical foe. He changed his big concession to people like Colin Powell, who said, come on, Mitt, think. That's just not the case. Was to say, no, Russia is our biggest #1 geopolitical adversary. To which I say, if you look at the women's gymnastics, if you look at Serena Williams' manhandling of a Russian tennis player the other day on the court, I suggest that Mitt needs to get a little girl power, and then he can stop worrying about Russia quite so much.
So let's see. We were talking about how Russia is our greatest geopolitical adversary and exulting in U.S. domination of Russia in the Olympics. So in other words, it's 1980s all over again.
It is, and all we need is the big hair.
Yes. Ooh, that would be bad.
But you raise a great point again about Romney's worldview, which I actually find really interesting, both from a substantive and political point of view. Which is it the 1980s all over again? That in some ways, Romney is actually trying to run a 1980 style "It's Morning in America" campaign for those real foreign policy geeks who watched the surrogates debate that Brookings held last week between
Rich Williamson and Michelle Flournoy. Yeah.
Rich Williamson and Michelle Flournoy. Rich actually said Reagan when he meant Romney on several occasions, which
I believe he also mistakenly said the Soviet Union instead of Russia at one point.
Yeah. He did. I wasn't going to go there.
No, I think really this is one of those things where I am actually willing to give a blanket, dismissal of this sort of criticism when people make it. I mean, for people of a certain age, and of course you and I are below that age, but for people of a certain age, conflating the Soviet Union and Russia, it's just, it's one of those ticks. I don't think you should read too much into it, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you, actually, but when you combine that tick, the Reagan tick, and the need to bring an adversarial point of view on Russia into the political space, that I'm still working. I mean, I think from the political side, it's actually more understandable in that there is a segment of older, more likely to vote voters whose worldview was formed well before the 1980s, actually. And so it's an appeal to them, and that I understand. But in terms of how, somebody whose professional identity was formed in the free and crazy world of international business consulting, how that kind of person can actually think about the world in Soviet terms, I find kind of hard to understand.
Well, I mean, okay, I would say a few things on this. First, I agree with you that I actually think Romney is trying to run a Reagan-esque campaign. Not exactly the 80s. I mean, he's trying to replay the 1980 campaign. Yes. And if I was Romney, I would probably try to do that too, because, I mean, he really can make the argument, look, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And a fair amount of the country is going to be able to say no. Now, whether or not you think, and whether or not the voters think that's Barack Obama's fault or not, is a separate question. But I mean, if I were him, I'd run that campaign as well. And maybe in some ways, that the Soviet Union stuff, or the sort of Russia as great adversary, kind of subconsciously evokes that stuff. But I have to say, I think I've heard arguments about this from a fair number of people about the sort of various ticks that Romney made along this sort of trip, where the notion is that really this was some sort of, dog whistle to voters that want to identify with the 80s, that, think of the Soviet Union and think, oh, this is comforting rhetoric, or that, praise the Israelis or Jews for their greater culture. That'll, please Florida retirees and so on and so forth. I got to say, I think that's too clever by like half. It's worth remembering the reason Romney, I think, scheduled this trip when he did was in part so he could go to the Olympics in Great Britain, but it was also in part because the Olympics were on, and therefore no voters gave a crap about any of this. So as much as this trip might be inferred as not great for him, this was the perfect timing, because I really think you and I cared a lot about this, and the political press cared a lot about this. I really don't think that voters care at all about this. And in some ways, it really depends on whether or not you think, and we can debate, I want to debate the whole culture things. I think that's really interesting. But, it depends on whether or not you think voters still get their cues from elites who then look at this trip and think, ooh, this could have gone better. I don't think voters do that anymore. Or not a lot of voters do that anymore. So in the end, I think it's a wash. It doesn't matter all that much.
I agree with most of what you've said. The timing around the Olympics, and except that I think the two things aren't mutually exclusive. That you can dog whistle, and you can deliberately be dog whistling at a time that most voters won't notice. And so that would be my first point. And my second point would be, and I think I'd like to break down your voters don't take their cues from elites argument, because where I see this as potentially having an impact, although no normal human beings cared about it, as you say, is that the political media was taken aback by what it saw. And that's going to affect how it frames Romney going forward. And that is an albatross that he really didn't need. And what I mean by that is Romney wasn't comfortable. He wasn't smooth. He, stepped off the plane and offended his British hosts, which may, in some funny ways turn out to have been the most serious gaffe that he made. Because it is just the one that you sort of slap your head and say, wait, Mitt Romney knows better than that.
And that actually was the sort of Michael Kinsley definition of a gaffe, which was he actually spoke the truth on that one. But you're right. You can say whether or not he should have actually said it out loud. So go ahead.
Right. So I do think, and because the public may think that it doesn't need elites to tell it what to think, but how the public sees the candidates is so strongly conditioned by the media lens that gets shown on them. And the number of pieces written by reporters saying, hey, wait a minute, Romney doesn't really have it together. And this is where I trot out sort of the elements of an op-ed piece I never managed to write for myself this week, which was, what did we actually learn from this week? Romney is not instinctively comfortable on these issues. He needed to be heavily scripted. He made gaffes when he wasn't. And his team is not in control on this stuff. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon, the irony of a week that ended with sort of interesting commentary about Jewish and Palestinian culture started with a dumb remark about Anglo-Saxon culture, which I believe that Romney personally wasn't responsible for, never wanted anybody to do that. But the idea that you have a Republican campaign with, the advisors going around mouthing off like that, Dan Senor suddenly getting profiled all over the place. Which,
that's interesting.
The story should not be about. I don't begrudge Mr. Senor and his profiles, but the story should not be about Dan Senor right now.
Okay, a couple of things on this. First, with respect to the Anglo-Saxon thing, I mean, let's be blunt. This is the Daily Telegraph. We don't know who actually said that to him, and I think the Romney campaign walked that back pretty effectively. So, I'm willing to assume that there was nothing even remotely that the Romney people would have intended. On your point about the political press not sort of being appalled by what they saw, I would, on the one hand, agree with you. I mean, I got enough calls from political reporters asking me to comment on something to get a distinct impression that they were not terribly impressed. But I think that cuts both ways. And in some ways, this gets to the one gaffe that happened, or not gaffe, the incident that happened at the Polish, on the Polish leg of the trip, where the Romney press spokesman, told the press to kiss my ass and to shove it and so forth, and then he had to apologize. He apologized a couple hours later. But I mean, if you watch the video of that, I can't blame entirely the guy for saying those things because you heard the questions that were being asked of Romney as he was walking to his car. What about your gaffes, Mr. Romney? I mean, I cannot stress how much of a dumbass question that really is, because it's just, how the hell do you answer that? It's just, I think Brendan Nye had a pretty good piece in the Columbia Journalism Review pointing out that in some ways the press's relationship with Romney now, you'd have to go back to the way the press sort of loathed Al Gore in the 2000 election to go back to a time when they're that adversarial. And the interesting question is whether or not Romney can use this to his advantage to the point of saying, look, I think the only way I'm going to win is to rally my base. I can show my base, look, the press is my enemy, and look how they're treating me and mine. So, you can sort of tune out what the media says.
It didn't work out all that well for Sarah Palin. I also, though, just on the Warsaw, the Poland gaffe. Yeah. I mean, Dan, you teach, and I'm sure that at the...
Look, I've said kiss my ass at least 3 times every lecture. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, you get crappy student papers. I'm even at the Fletcher School, I'm sure you get papers that have made you sort of want to say to the student whatever the rude...
All my Fletcher students write very well-crafted and well-researched and well-written papers.
But the point is, if you at Fletcher, or maybe at an institution where you taught in the past...
Okay, yeah, let's go with that. That's good. Okay.
Yeah, at an institution where you taught in the past, I'm sure you've gotten some papers that made you want to call in the student and say, you think I'm going to read this piece of crap? You can kiss my... But here's the thing, if you did that, I would say, yeah, it's really horrible because they, I'm having a brainwave because Skype is bleeding at my screen. I guess I have to decline it. Pardon me, viewers, while I just go away, Skype. So you could complain and say, well, I was justified because you just wouldn't believe how terrible this paper was. And both you would be right, and it would be your freaking job never to say kiss my ass to a student. Yes. And if you can't deal with the media without telling them to kiss your ass, then you shouldn't be... You have no business being a press flack. And when you get to the presidential level, you know what? There are 20 would-be press flacks who could step in and take your place and not do that. So this is where I can't get why the campaign doesn't run better than that. Because you just don't do that. I don't care how annoying they are.
I will say there was an excellent piece, I think, in BuzzFeed, I think by Zeke Miller, pointing out that part of the reason Gorka, I think is his last name, part of the reason Gorka finally flew off the handle is that he's not being given that much to work with in terms of dealing with the press. I mean, so in some ways, I think I agree with you that this is less about Gorka than it is about the Romney campaign more generally and how particularly the foreign policy and press people are being organized. And in that sense, the trip was kind of odd where, I think on the Israel leg, for example, you had, this thing where first they were going to close off the fundraiser of the press and then they finally reversed course on that. And then you had Dan Senor, I think, actually say something about, a Romney president would stand behind Israel 100% if it attacked Iran. I mean, I think Romney himself walked that back. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, he did. And you also raise, I mean, again, I really recommend for the wonks in the audience, this Brookings video debate between Rich Williamson and Michelle Flournoy that Marvin Kalb moderated. And, you thought there was no serious moderating left in politics. Williamson and I really like Ambassador Williamson. He's a delightful person. He's a public servant. He did some good work in Sudan and other places over the years. He's back when, well, no, that's not true. We still had a dirty little secret. We still have, at my level, bipartisan comedy in Washington. That's ITY, not EDY. And I think highly of him. He was asked 3 times how Romney would pay for his proposal to add 100,000 ground troops and almost double our rate of shipbuilding. Yeah. And he had it was painful to watch. He had no answer. The campaign, and Rich, he's a smart man, the campaign hadn't given him anything.
Right,
and that's malpractice.
Well, I think, again, it's like Reagan in 1980. In some ways, it's almost the exact same political program, which is Romney promises to boost defense spending, cut taxes, and balance the budget. It's that third part that's, Reagan was a little weak on in the early 80s, and that Romney is going to be even weaker on, going forward. I think this is one of those things where, in part, the issue about Romney's trip, I think some of the gaffes were overblown. I think some of them were not that big of a deal. But in some ways, the problem is that if you don't have that much in the way of substance on foreign policy, or rather coherent substance on foreign policy, then all anyone can pick apart are these sort of surface things, which in the end, this trip was about. And in that sense, I'm not sure the trip went it didn't go terribly.
So this raises a historical question that I have, and that I think you'll have an interesting view on. Okay. So, ironically, George W. Bush's campaign in 2000, you had Condoleezza Rice writing a piece in Foreign Affairs that posed a really intelligent critique of nation building, except that we weren't actually nation building at the time. So it works much better as a critique of what came later. But including the immortal line that the 82nd Airborne shouldn't be taking kids to kindergarten. Right. And you had W saying that the U.S. should be a humble nation in approaching the world, and leaving aside that isn't what happened. Right. I was recently talking to people who were in Little Rock with Bill Clinton in 92, who were sort of saying with great pride, we had to beat a sitting foreign policy president, and we did it by being relentlessly and annoyingly detailed. And, you remember Butchers of Beijing, and that he went after the Chicken Kiev for Bush for giving, quote, a Chicken Kiev speech that told the Ukrainians not to break up the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And then Reagan in 1980, Reagan's ideas were derided as crazy, but he did have national security.
Serious ideas,
I wasn't going to use the word serious, but ideas you could identify as an idea.
Yeah.
And then, Kerry certainly mounted a pretty comprehensive critique of W in 2004. Not that it did any good, but he did do it. And Bob Dole in 96, was identified with taking very hawkish stands in the Balkans.
Okay.
So I'm struck by just how, by historical bipartisan standards, the Romney campaign is kind of devoid of content on our issue set.
I'm trying to think of a way to defend Romney on this one. I would say 2 things. The first is that there is a way in which I do agree with you that I think the campaign you'd have to go back to would be the Dukakis 88 campaign.
That was harsh, Dan.
I went there. Because as you point out, Kerry, campaigned on foreign policy. Bush didn't campaign so much on foreign policy, but you're right. You looked at his team and you said, okay, they did look like an assemblage of grown-ups, pre-2001. And Clinton, I'm not sure I buy the Clinton argument. They did talk about foreign policy, but let's face it, they didn't win that election on foreign policy. So I think in some ways, you got to go back to Dukakis 88. On the other hand, as you point out, that Brookings thing that was very interesting between Williamson and Flournoy, the fact is that if you actually figure out, whenever Williamson got pushed to say, what will a Romney administration do on issue X, the dirty secret is that more than 3/4 of the time, the answer that Williamson was giving was pretty much identical in substance to what Obama was doing right now. Now, this is an interesting, and I think Peter Baker had a great piece in the New York Times last Sunday that made this point. that basically if you took a look at their foreign policies, in terms of actual what they were, policy statements, there wasn't all that much between the two. Now, what's fascinating about this is that, I don't think the Romney people want to admit this because they're trying to claim that, Obama is this awful foreign policy president. He's made the country weaker. We're not safe, and so on and so forth. But there is a way in which I think the Obama administration doesn't want to admit this either, because if they do admit it, it means that really one of Barack Obama's strengths ceases to be that much of his strength, because it turns out that Romney would wind up doing pretty much the same thing anyway. So, I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Well, I do feel like you and I had this argument the last Blogging Heads we did, so I feel like maybe I should apologize to the audience. The way that I think that point is correct is that there is a center in American national security thinking, and that center is wholly occupied by Barack Obama's administration at this point. That there's just the wing of the Republican Party that takes those views is wholly kind of in abeyance at this point, or it's hiding out on Romney's advisory committee and leaking to the New York Times that nobody will listen to it. So that on, sort of the idea that you want to pursue a negotiated settlement with Iran and that you have time to do so, which the Pentagon thinks, that you can't afford to continue growing the defense budget while you run the rest of our economy into the ground, which the Pentagon also says, the Senate Chairman of the Joint Chiefs will say, that Russia is a challenging, unpleasant country to deal with, and that we have no choice but to put up an approach that's collaborate where we can and push back where we can't. China, in its own way, that you need to take China seriously. You need to not provoke confrontation with China. That's all kind of unremarkable in a large segment of the American national security establishment, and the Republican political establishment is totally outside that. So either a candidate has to stake out positions that are outside that establishment consensus, or a candidate has to use rhetoric that conceals his positions being within that establishment consensus.
Right, and I would argue, my hunch is that Romney is doing the latter, that you're seeing a lot of nasty rhetoric, and I think in the end, I'm not sure how much it amounts to. But I will grant you 2 points. The first is we don't know. Last time we talked about this, we were talking about John Bolton's influence, and it's not, it's not clear what would happen if, in fact, that faction of the Romney campaign were to actually be ascendant if he were to win. But the second thing, and this is perhaps the better answer, and I'm surprised the Obama people aren't pushing back harder on this, is that even if you think that a Romney, administration would likely wind up in the same place where an Obama administration is right now, they've so badly handled the campaign portion of things that, the Obama people could legitimately go out and say, yeah, okay, but who do you want to manage foreign policy better? The guys who have been doing it for 4 years and not doing that half bad of a job, or the guys who can't execute a photo op trip without, tripping over themselves every news cycle.
And that goes back to my point about how that trip will end up mattering, which is that any time, Romney now comes out with, I was a great manager, all the Obama campaign flag has to do is look at the reporter and say, really? Remember Boris Johnson making fun of him in front of a crowd of 100,000 Londoners?
Yes, which will be the only time liberals are really big fans of Boris Johnson, but
it was remarkable, wasn't it? Yes.
But I want to move slightly to a thing in which I'm actually very grateful for Mitt Romney, which is this whole issue about culture playing a role between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He gave this speech, in Jerusalem that made a big hullabaloo, and then Romney doubled down with an essay in National Review, and then yesterday, and I blogged about this. Yesterday, Mitt Romney suffered what I can only describe as the Marshall McLuhan moment in Annie Hall, and which, as a professor, is my personal nightmare, in which all the people that he cited basically wrote op-eds saying, you know nothing of my work. He was, Jared Diamond had a piece in the New York Times basically saying, what the hell are you talking about? You're describing my work in a way that I don't recognize. In foreignpolicy.com, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson said, what the hell is Romney talking about when he's talking about culture? He's really talking about institutions. Now, as a social scientist, I find this absolutely, horrifying, just from a personal sense of, dear God, that could be me. but again, I'm not entirely sure it matters for everyone else. But I do like this. If nothing else, I'm really happy for Mitt Romney because it actually prompted a whole bunch of people who are really smart to talk about what actually does promote economic development, which strikes me as a really important question. And these people aren't ordinarily, necessarily making a lot of news headlines. So I'm actually kind of happy about that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed actually the byplay of op-eds and blog posts among people who've written books on this topic recently. And we will post the links to that because it was really a nice little course for those of us who don't get back to school regularly on the sort of the state of the debate on what prompts economic growth, what shapes societies, and it was sort of all the, and then a lot of the other thing that I just enjoyed was that even in the context of rebutting Romney, they were all also rebutting each other.
Right.
There was the sort of, Romney mischaracterized Jared Diamond's argument, and by the way, Jared's argument is wrong, and here's why. Kind of
no, that's true. I mean, I link to the Jared Diamond argument, and I think I will give Jared Diamond credit on, saying Mitt Romney misread my Jared Diamond's work. I actually don't agree with much of the rest of what he wrote. And then, the Acemoglu and Robinson piece was really funny because in some ways this actually speaks to an interesting problem, I think, about how social scientists try to interact with sort of the political world, which is, if you actually read what Romney was writing in National Review and what he said in the speech, he kept using the word culture, but I really think that when he defined what he meant by culture, which is like Americans wanting freedom, and then he's referred to the Constitution and so on and so forth, he was really talking about institutions. Now, conservatives will come back with saying, yes, but aren't institutions born out of culture? Actually, I don't think it's that simple. And institutions are of somewhat shorter duration and, in fact, institutions can make culture rather than vice versa. So what was really funny was watching Acemoglu and Robinson saying, Romney has no idea what he's talking about. This is what actually is what drove Israeli growth. But actually, in the end, they were talking about institutions as well. So the reason I'm saying all this is that social scientists often tie themselves up in knots because they say, you're using the wrong terminology, which is really not all that damning an indictment in the political world.
Yeah, so you're actually making me want to take a turn defending Romney there because I mean he knew what he meant and what he was talking about, and I might not agree with it, but it wasn't stupid. Mm-hmm. And I also I don't really see how if institutions are an ephemeral product of culture, then what Romney did mean was culture, because I actually, and I'll make a political point in a second that explains this, because I actually do think he meant culture in the deep sense. And the reason I say that is that the fascinating thing that came out was that this was not the first time that he had made this point, and that his campaign went out of its way to point out that he had also said this kind of thing about Mexicans with respect to the United States and Ecuadorians with respect to Chile. So he seems to believe very deeply that the other thing is in each case there's a difference of appearance as well, of course, which, sort of gets the goat of liberals like me. But he really does seem to believe that it is culture. The other just sort of layperson's question that I'll put out there and embarrass myself on behalf of all the other lay people out there is that I read all of the commentary that we've been discussing, and I thought, well, I feel like there's an element of truth in both of these based on what I know of and how I see the world, that there are things Diamond says I agree with, and there are things that Acemoglu and his co-authors say that I agree with, and I don't quite understand why you guys have to spend so much time rubbishing each other, and when clearly you've each got, some piece of our reality. And I guess that, ladies and gentlemen, is why my sister is the family PhD.
Okay, I would say a few things on this. The first is that in answer to your question about whether institutions are ephemeral versus culture and so on and so forth, I guess the answer I would give is that, yes, institutions are more mutable than culture. That said, institutions are also pretty hard to change. It's just that culture is really, really super hard to change.
Yeah, I'm right with you on that.
So, and then the second thing is that what's interesting is that, the examples Romney gives are these same examples that Acemoglu and Robinson give. The one example that Romney doesn't mention, in some ways it's the best example, is the difference between North Korea and South Korea. And that's an answer where it's clearly not culture. It has nothing to do with culture. as we would, as either the layperson or the or social scientists would think about it. It has everything to do with the way political and economic institutions are set up. It's an extremely stark example. But I like your larger point about, well, why can't it, there is no monocausal story about this. And I think you're right, but here's the complicating factor. And there's a reason why you've got this debate. It's not like, this argument ain't going to be settled anytime soon. It's because a lot of the factors that people talk about very often wind up, it's whether you think of them as the cause or are they being caused by something even deeper. So, with respect to the institutions and culture argument, it becomes a question of, well, do you have the right institutions because there was a pre-existing culture that allowed those kinds of institutions to prosper? Or is it that the culture eventually developed because you got the right institutions at one point or another? And here there is a distinction, because Acemoglu and Robinson in particular are very clear in their book in saying, look, we think what matters first is institutions. That you can have very, very slight differences in culture that over time get much more magnified because the institutions create some sort of path-dependent effect. And then with respect to Diamond, I'm not going to, I tend to kind of reject the geographical determinist argument that he makes, so I'm less persuaded by that one, I guess.
I mean, I'm fascinated because I think it's worth pulling this back to what Romney actually said and didn't say, and that, I think the thing that many of us objected to was the idea that you could explain the difference between Israeli and Palestinian economic success without any reference to what it's like to have your society occupied.
Right,
and
obviously.
No, but the real question there is Romney saying that the Palestinians are occupied because of something fundamental about their culture? And on the one hand, I'm grossly putting words into his mouth there, but in another way, I'm actually probably not putting words too far into his mouth on that. And that's where you get to some views of the world that are really pretty problematic.
Yes, and now I'm just seeing minefields all around me as we start talking about this.
Yeah. No, I don't. I mean, and I'm going to say very bluntly about this that I am quite happy to end this discussion here because I'm well aware of the capacity of people to snip little bits of these long and ruminative discussions, and I don't want to see that happen to you, and I don't want to see it happen to me either. But I, that's. So both that set of questions are there, and that it's really problematic to talk about them on video are two of the interesting realities of American political life. Yeah,
I would tend to agree. I mean, I think the basic problem with the argument is you could, in theory, make the case that the reason the Palestinians are that culture is the ultimate determining variable. That culture leads to a population's views about its neighbors that then, forces that kind of military response. I think that's a really weak sauce argument.
Yeah, I'm really not interested in that because it takes away, making any one variable the explanation of everything is kind of the same as throwing up your hands and saying there is no explanation, God did it.
But actually, I will say this, and I guess it's a defense of Mitt Romney. By bringing up the culture, point, you can argue it actually is evidence that Romney really is in some ways a principled conservative, because this is the conservative argument. The conservative argument, there's that very famous Daniel Patrick Moynihan quote that, the central conservative truth is that culture is what matters, and is what is determinative. And the central liberal truth is that culture can be changed by policy. I'm mangling it, I'm sure, but that is in essence, what Moynihan was saying. And you can argue that Romney, by saying culture is in fact the key thing that matters, is articulating what a lot of conservatives, believe, which is trying to change societies is ridiculously hard, and in some instances is a fantasy. And if you, adhere to the liberal delusion that you can do this relatively easily, you're going to get yourself in all kinds of trouble. Now, what is startling is in some ways how very, very different that kind of deep philosophy is from, let's say, the philosophy the Bush administration was articulating when they invaded Iraq in 2003. And so I'm kind of curious exactly how you married that kind of deep cultural argument with, neoconservative arguments about we need to help lots of places. And I think in some ways that's actually not a you can't simultaneously be a neoconservative and buy into that culture.
The other point, that I would make, and where I don't recognize my own view of the world in Moynihan's dichotomy, is that you can also believe that you don't so much need to change cultures as you need to liberate or promote the parts of them that work well. As a lot of people said, Palestine has a fabulous entrepreneurial culture. And, Bill Clinton said something which, sort of fell perilously close to some of my best friends are African American, but also, he said, I don't know any poor Palestinians. Every Palestinian I know in America is either a university professor or a doctor.
I'm sure I'm trying to recover from that impersonation. That was awesome.
I did work for the man.
I know.
But that, and that's it's a way of making that point that's problematic, but that Palestine historically had an amazing entrepreneurial class, and so then you ask the question, what's getting in the way of that entrepreneurial class, and how? And then that's my mind sort of leads you back to the political question, but so you don't have to think everything's not about changing culture unless you think that everybody else's culture except yours is bad.
No, and ironically, David Landis, who's the guy who Romney kept quoting, saying in his book, Wealth and Poverty of Nations, in the end it all boils down to culture. He says that on a page. If you then turn to the next page, Landis says, but it's not only culture. And that, in fact, he actually makes this point that if you don't think it's culture, it clearly is not just culture, because take a look at, people who live in one society versus those who emigrate, to somewhere else and then thrive and prosper. And in some ways, Palestinians are the perfect example of this. But that said, I'm actually really, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not this is the most, we've talked about it, whether this is the most vacuous campaign in our memory. And I will say this week it was not vacuous. It was actually pretty damn substantive. And so we're never going to settle this debate, but whether or not this was intentional or not, I'm just super psyched that we wound up having this kind of conversation.
Well, speaking of how difficult it is to change institutions, I actually need to jump off and get on a phone call about defense budget reform, which is sobering in terms of thinking about both culture and institutions. But this has been great, and as you say, and this conversation has been the most substantive about the election I expect to have all season.
Oh, Heather, thank you. It's always the case when I talk to you.
So, until next time.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.